Oh, it's so good to be back recording from the Holy Land again today. Here we are in the last few days of October. And things have happened a lot in Israel since we last talked, and much is going on. Prophecy is being fulfilled, and so pretty exciting to hear what you have today, Rabbi.
Okay. The truth of the matter is that if we focus exclusively on a narrow window of the present, we really don't know where things are heading because, well, as unfortunately we're all too well aware, the supposed ceasefire doesn't seem to be in any way being actualized. That is, unfortunately,
Which is how it's reported over here is a lot different. You would think that it's absolutely over. Yet I have this app on my phone that shows when missiles are being fired into Israel, and it hasn't stopped.
Yeah, and for a ceasefire, well, a soldier was killed yesterday. 37 years old, 5 children who are now orphans. Yeah, every individual story is just a story of such horrific tragedy, and it's because the terrorists couldn't care less about ceasefire. Their version of a ceasefire is we cease, they fire.
Right.
But let's get prophetic here, get more of a bird's eye view on what's taking place. And the truth of the matter is, I'd like to share something that is extraordinarily timely, specifically for today, in Joel chapter 2, which is another one of the many prophecies that we have been plunging into in getting a sense of the renewal of the Holy Land. So in Joel chapter 2, I'm going to start from verse 21. We read, "Fear not, O land, be glad and rejoice, for the Lord has done great things. Be not afraid, beasts of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness do put forth grass, for the tree bears its fruit, the fig tree and the vine do yield their strength. Be glad then, you children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he gives you the former rain in just measure, and he causes to come down for you the former rain and the latter rain at the first." And of course, the consequence then, the next 3 verses talk about the extraordinary plenty. The floors shall be full of corn, the vat shall roar with wine and oil, and you shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and shall praise the name of the Lord your God that has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be ashamed. And you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God, and there is none else, and my people shall never be ashamed. So, of course, these are words of tremendous, tremendous consolation. And to put a particularly timely spin on this, I'd like to focus on verse 23 and the realization that the words here in the Hebrew original that we're translating as former rain and latter rain, in the Hebrew moreh or yoreh versus malkosh, pertain to concepts that most English speakers never heard of, and frankly wouldn't make any sense if we would invoke them in a place like the U.S. What's former rain, latter rain? What's that about? But of course, this isn't America. This is the land of Israel. And the land of Israel, yes, we have a well-defined sequence that includes former rain, latter rain, all of good ways of translating into English, but the realization that for half the year, there is no rain. There is no rain because there's a well-defined dry season, and then there's a rainy season. And I think we've already noted this in the rhythm that the Bible establishes with respect to the feasts Passover is also known as Chag HaAviv. The holiday of spring, Aviv also carries the connotation of blossoming, putting forth fruit, and then we see explicitly in the Bible that Pentecost, Shavuot, is the festival of harvest because the growing season has ended, the rainy season has ended, and whatever you've produced over the course of the agricultural year is ready for harvesting. And what do you do with the harvest? Traditionally, you leave it out into the field. And there are still certain components of the harvest that even in Israel today, after the harvest, are left out in the field. I know they do this with the peanut crop, and they do it with the cotton crop. They leave them out in the field because under the hot summer sun, the produce will desiccate. And of course, in bygone years, that was done with all the grain, because you want to grind grain into flour, you want the grains to be dried up. So that was the harvest festival. But the festival of ingathering, which is, of course, explicitly the way the Bible refers to the festival of Sukkot, the festival of booths, in Exodus chapter 23 and Exodus chapter 34, Chag HaSit, the festival of ingathering, is when you bring the produce inside this time of year, because we pray it's about to start raining, and you wanted everything to get dried up under the hot summer sun. Well, you're going to inside fast, then all of your efforts will be for naught because they'll get rained on.
Right?
The possibility of rain here in the summer months is not low, and it's not negligible. It is zero. And at this point, of course, we are very much looking forward to the rainy season. So the reason that today in particular is a very relevant day, I think the most relevant of days, for talking about the Yorer, Mereh, and the Malkot, these rains that delimit the rainy season. The first rain, the last rain, is because today is a very special day in Jewish prayer in the land of Israel. We begin today. Today, of course, means last night because the day begins in the evening, as we see in creation. It was evening and it was morning. We start with the evening. Last night we began beseeching God to send rains of blessing in the Holy Land. Now, some folks may be wondering, you may be aware that we say the prayer for rain actually a couple of weeks ago on the last day of the festival of Sukkot. The eighth day is when we say the prayer for rain. So why start imploring God for rain only today, which to be precise is 15 days later? And it's a little bit complex, but I think it's really amazing to appreciate the answer here. Officially, we regard the rainy season as beginning on that last day of the festival of Sukkot. That's why it's the festival of ingathering, because the rains are about to come. And from that day and on, when we speak to God at least 3 times a day in prayer, we praise God as the one who causes the wind to blow and the rain to fall. We don't do that during the summer because it's not a time when we want the rain to be falling. Again, the crops are out of the field. So we're praising God as we are situated in the rainy season from the end of the holiday Sukkot. But we don't actually implore God to send the rain until 15 days later. Why?
Yeah, you have my complete attention. Why?
So the answer is actually it's pretty straightforward, but it's in a way mind-boggling. Because remember, Sukkot is a pilgrim festival. That means that when the Holy Temple is standing, all Israel converge on the Holy Temple to Jerusalem for the festival of Sukkot. And then afterward, they need to get back home. Well, can you imagine, especially in the old days when they didn't have cars that had roofs, what it would be like to have to make the trek back home in the rain? And the calculation in instituting this 15-day lag period is that 15 days are long enough for the folks who live furthest away from Jerusalem to be able to make it home. And we only start asking for God to actually send the rain, as opposed to praising him because it's the rainy season. But we only start actually imploring God to send the rain when everyone can be back home, so no one gets rained on. 15 days. And of course, some people might be wondering, wait a second, isn't this only when the temple is standing? The temple hasn't been standing for close to 2 millennia. Yeah, well, we don't care about that little detail. We have to live in the rhythm of the ideal, even as we confront the real. In the ideal, the Holy Temple is standing. In the ideal, we want to make sure people can get back home after coming to the Holy Temple for the festival of Sukkot. So to this day, we only actually begin asking for rain 15 days after the festival is over. And that's today.
That couldn't be right, which is October 29th. If you're listening to this podcast later. So,
of course, every year it'll be a different date on the Gregorian calendar because it's determined by 15 days after Sukkot. In the Hebrew calendar, the 7th day of the month of Mar Cheshvan.
Right.
And for the record, by the way, this doesn't inform the day upon which people who live outside of the Holy Land begin imploring God for rain, because that is based upon a different rhythm. But we in the Holy Land resonate with the rhythm of the Holy Land, and again, with our faith and confidence that the Holy Temple will be restored by God. And we'll need to wait 15 days in order to ensure that people can get back home.
And so, getting back to Joel and the idea of the former rain, meaning the rain from last year.
So no, it's a bad translation in that really the Yoreh or Moreh in the words of Joel in Deuteronomy, it's Yoreh, but it's the same root, refers to the first rain of the season. That is, the first rain of the season is what will be considered the Yoreh. Unfortunately, because we really need the rain already, and last year was a very dry year, we have not yet had our Yoreh. But Yoreh is a term that people use in contemporary Hebrew as well, that when the first really good rain comes, then people will say this is the Yoreh. And we haven't gotten it yet. And so that's why Joel promises the Yoreh will be for a blessing, and also the Malkosh, the latter rain, in the sense of the rain that comes just before the end of the growing season, just before the harvest.
Which is also critical to the harvest.
Right. Absolutely. It has to come at the right time because, of course, if it comes too late, then it could cause produce to rot. And if it comes too early, then produce could end up drying on the tree or vine before it's ready for harvesting.
Which is exactly, where we happen to be here in North Carolina. We experience similar situations, not in the same rhythm that you're referring to. However, fascinatingly, today, I would say over the last few days, we have gotten our first rains of the rainy season that happens in October here, just based on the weather patterns of where this is. However, we didn't get the last rains that we needed in order for people. So a lot of people lost their bean crop, they lost their corn crop, whatever, because they didn't get those latter rains. It's still the same kind of thing, interestingly. But that's amazing when you think about it, that what he's actually, when you give that understanding, you go, okay, in agriculture, you're always dependent on God, like we've talked about throughout this, that, rain comes via that. If you're not using irrigation, you're dependent on God. And here you are, whether you're in North Carolina or you're in Jerusalem, if you're growing crops and you're not doing irrigation, these issues are actually quite critical to you. In fact, when we take our offering, this just is a side note of what I think is fun. We always take up a special offering for rain. They bring quarters. When you put quarters in the offering plate, you're asking God to bring the rain for whatever season it is that we happen to need it for. And it's a fascinating thing here at Kildee, because again, the people that worship here, they depend on rain, not just for crops, but actually for the livestock as well, which a lot of them grow livestock, and their issue with the rain is just as heavy as everybody else's, because if there's no food for the animals, then
there won't be any grass, obviously, if the rain doesn't come.
And I like that as I get an idea of the way God sustains us is through food, and the idea of rain being so close to Torah. And almost, isn't it fascinating to me, and I'm sure you're going to make this connection, that in these days, I feel God is bringing Torah, bringing rain, bringing understanding that hasn't been here in this season for something that he obviously is doing, per what you're talking about. And the idea of that from a Torah standpoint is that there's this first rain and then there's latter rains coming. It's pretty exciting, right? And a harvest, etc., right?
So I have to tell you, I have a little bit of a traffic jam in my brain right now, because there are so many passages that are vying with one another to come off of my tongue right now. I think I'd like to start with 2 from Deuteronomy. First, one with which undoubtedly many folks are familiar, and that is in the description of the Holy Land in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. The Lord your God brings you into a good land, a land of watercourses, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines, which we understand as grapevines, and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and date honey. And inevitably, when you consider what the significance of these species is, these are 7 species, and this is an auspicious list. These are species with which the land of Israel is being praised, and they have, as a result, unequivocally a special status in our tradition, in our blessings, And also in the bringing of the first fruits to the Holy Temple. Bringing the first fruits to the Holy Temple is the ceremony that is so vividly described in Deuteronomy in chapter 26. You bring the first fruits to the temple, you make a declaration before God of special thanksgiving. And inevitably the question is, why specifically these 7 species? And I remember hearing an answer quite a number of years ago. I still remember the circumstance. The circumstance was that our children were young, and it was during the intermediate days of one of the holidays. I don't remember if it was the holiday of Tabernacles or Passover, but we used to go on family outings. And there's a beautiful place in Samaria. It's called Neot Kedumim, which I guess could be rendered as ancient groves. And the whole theme of these botanical gardens is exclusively biblical. To see all of the flora that's mentioned in the Bible, and to get an understanding of the aspect that pertains to plant life and growth and agriculture that is so thoroughly intertwined with biblical messages. And one of the trails that they had in Od Kedumim was called the Trail of the 7 Species. And I remember we went on that trail as a family, and we had a guide on the trail who I recall made the observation, we have various other species with which the land is being praised. What's so special about these 7? And by our tradition, the first fruits are brought specifically from these 7 species. She said, agriculturally, these 7 species, each one for a different reason, is extremely sensitive to the pattern of rainfall between Passover and Pentecost. And it can make a colossal difference. If the rain comes at the right time or the wrong time, the whole crop can be completely destroyed. And inevitably, as a result, the ancient Canaanites, who of course were pagans, developed a whole pagan ritual around these 7 species. And so, when Israel is on the brink of entering into the Holy Land, God tells us about these 7 species. And it's not in any way going to be engaging in some kind of pagan rituals in order to secure the rains from the gods by doing all sorts of heinous abominations like child sacrifice and the like. No, it's not going to be doing anything, as it were, as a ritual to get the rains, other than, of course, there's prayer. It's the thanksgiving to God for the bounty after the harvest. And you bring these 7 species into the Holy Temple, and you declare your thanksgiving to God and your complete appreciation that all the bounty comes from Him, not from all these various gods with their despicable rituals. It's a matter of thanksgiving to God. So it's a kind of counterbalance to what was in vogue in the pagan nations that surrounded Israel, precisely in that time of year. The first fruits are being brought from Pentecost and on. It is precisely this time of year to be thinking in terms of that, in terms of Thanksgiving, precisely because of the sensitivity to the pattern of rainfall, just as the rainy season is drawing to a close. So that's one aspect that definitely comes to mind. But there's another one that in a way kind of dovetails with what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 7. There was reference here to the water springing forth from the valleys and the hills. And inevitably what this calls to mind is what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 10, which is also explicitly in praise of the Holy Land. Starting in verse 10, for the land into which you go to possess it is not like the land of Egypt, whence you came forth, where you sow your seed and you water it by foot like a verdant garden. By foot, meaning there's no rain in Egypt. You go down to the Nile and you get your buckets or you dig a canal and you water the fields when the Nile rises and comes into the canals, or again by bucket with your foot. But the land into which you go to possess it is a land of hills and valleys. It drinks of the rain of heaven. And inevitably, we need to consider what the comparison is telling us. That is, of course, you can say, well, you're not going to have to every day go down to the Nile with those buckets and drag up water in order to water your field. But, of course, inevitably, we appreciate there's a flip side to this. In Egypt, you never have to worry about a drought. You're not going to get the rain, but you're not depending upon rain. You're depending upon one of the greatest rivers on earth, the Nile. And the Nile is not going to run dry. I mean, even to the extent that in Zechariah chapter 14, when the nations come to celebrate Sukkot in Jerusalem, and there's a warning that if they don't, then they won't get the rain. But with Egypt, that's not going to be the warning, because Egypt doesn't need rain and doesn't depend upon rain, and it has its Nile, case closed. So Egypt, on the one hand, has the blessing of having a secure water source. And we don't. The land of Israel drinks from the rain of heaven. And maybe that's also part of the message. This is a land of hills and valleys. The water goes through the valleys. The truth of the matter is, maybe a better translation than hills would be mountains, because that's really what the Hebrew says. Harim, mountains and valleys. How's the water going to get to the mountains? No irrigation channel is going to bring the water up to the mountains. So you have a serious problem. You need to get the rain from you need to get the water from the rain that comes down from heaven, because there's no other way to be able to water the fields. And of course, inevitably, the additional relevant observation here is, so Egypt has the Nile. I always like to ask groups of pilgrims when they come here, have you been to Jordan? Oh, yeah. It's no Nile, is it? Not even close. It hardly ranks as a stream. We don't have major rivers. And what then is the inevitable conclusion? The inevitable conclusion is verse 12. It's a land that God your Lord looks after. The eyes of Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. This is a land that imposes upon you a regular dialogue with God. And that depends upon the rain. And we know sometimes the rain comes, sometimes the rain doesn't come. Means you need to be worthy of the rain coming. On a completely different plane. But I think indirectly very relevant, there's an expression that I think everyone knows very well that is recurrent throughout the Torah and the rest of the Bible, begins when God gives Moses the game plan with respect to the Exodus from Egypt and what the destination is going to be after bringing them out of Egypt. And the destination, as God expresses it, is to bring them to a land that is good and broad, a land that flows with milk and honey. Okay, so flowing with milk and honey is a very well-known recurrent theme. Or is it? Well, inevitably, it's always a question of translations. Of course, the Bible never says flows with milk and honey because the Bible isn't written in English. The Hebrew is Eretz Zavat Halav Udvash. And what we can't help but note conspicuously is, okay, Eretz, land, that's clear. Chalav, well, whether it means milk as in cow's milk, or it can also refer to white wine, maybe a debatable point, but it certainly is describing the plenitude that can come in this land. And with respect to honey as well, whether it's beef honey or sweet fruit that's likened to honey, it's also maybe a debatable point. But what about this word that we're translating as flow? Zavat is not the normal word for flow. And maybe the best way of exemplifying this is by recognizing that the root of Zavat, in all biblical Hebrew, of course, all words derive from a three-letter root. The three-letter root of Zavat, maybe not so intuitively obvious, is Zov, Zayin, Vav, Vet. Well, in all the Bible, the chapter of the Bible in which that root appears, I wouldn't just say more times than anyone else, but the most times, solid majority, is Leviticus chapter 15. This is not going to be for the squeamish or faint-hearted. Because what Leviticus chapter 15 is about is some kind of pathological flow that's coming out of people. It's associated with the genitals. There may be an allusion here to gonorrhea or to some other sexually transmitted disease, but it is a source of defilement. There is the description of the Zav, the person who has this pathological flow as a source of defilement, and what he or she needs to do about it in seeking purification after the flow has stopped. And I'm not going to go into all the gory details because I think it'll take us too far afield, but maybe better than flow, we should describe this as discharge. It certainly is not something that is a natural or normal flow. And one of the great Bible scholars of the late 19th century, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, I think we've had occasion to refer to him in the past as well, makes this observation. That, goodness, if the Bible really wanted to talk about a land that's naturally productive, that naturally flows with milk and honey, boy, is this the wrong verb to use. It's not normal flow. And truth is that we do find this verb in other contexts as well, but it's actually never normal flow. That is, to cite the other instances, in Lamentations chapter 4, verse 9, the prophet describes those who are slain with the sword as better than those who are slain with hunger, because the ones who are dying of hunger, they just flow away. Their souls got drain out, stricken through for want of the produce of the field. So again, it's certainly not a natural flow. In a more positive, but still completely unnatural sense, in both Psalm 78, verse 20, and in Psalm 105, verse 41, we read about water flowing out of a rock. And inevitably, we appreciate that it's also not natural flow. Behold, he smote the rock, and waters flowed out. Opened the rock, waters flowed out. Obviously, this is not a normal flow. And the last instance of this verb we'll note in Isaiah chapter 48, in verse 21, which is also really describing either the exodus from Egypt or the exodus from the Babylonian exile. They first did not, when he led them through the deserts, he caused the waters to flow out of the rock for them. He cleaved the rock also, and waters flowed out. And again, Yazufu, not natural flow. And the take-home message: we may call this land the land that flows with milk and honey, but it's not because it flows naturally. It flows when God makes it flow. It's a land that demands of us constant, ongoing awareness, consciousness, communication, being in sync with God. Otherwise, there's no flow. So, inevitably then, talk about what makes this land special. It is this extraordinarily precarious land that demands of us to constantly calibrate ourselves spiritually with God. And I have to admit that this is something very much on people's minds now, because we're practically at the end of October and we haven't had any rain. It's late. It is late. We're already imploring God to send the rain. And when I last checked, there wasn't any rain even in the long-term forecast. But hey, we just started praying for rain now, so obviously that can change.
So that's the physical look at all that, and clearly the agricultural look at all that. Isn't there a spiritual angle to that?
Absolutely. And of course, inevitably, since we are, after all, in the prophecy of Joel, one can't help but note the theme of flow, not so much flow, I would say, as pouring out, in God pouring out his Spirit. That is, it is Joel, after all, who describes in the description of what will be in the future to come. God says in chapter 3, this might be the end of chapter 2 for you, but I'm reading it as the beginning of chapter 3, one way or the other, same words. It shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit. So this pouring out of God's spirit, obviously, God's spirit isn't water. It's not literally liquid, but simultaneously, I always like to say that that's why we need to prepare vessels to receive God's spirit, because if we don't, then God's spirit ends up a puddle on the ground. We need to ready ourselves to receive God's spirit. But that theme, again, the way God describes his giving out his spirit to us is precisely using the metaphor of pouring out. And of course, in much this vein, also, we readily appreciate the theme of if you're thirsty, then go to the water, and of course, recognizing that that theme by no means pertains merely to physical water, but this is a description of how we are summoned ultimately to return to God. In Isaiah chapter 55, the very beginning of the chapter, "Oh, everyone that thirsts, come to the water. He that has no money, come buy and eat, come buy wine and milk without money and without price." But of course, obviously, the implication is not in any sense of mere physical sustenance, as emerges very clearly from what follows. "Hearken diligently to me and eat what is good. Let your soul delight itself in fatness." This isn't talking about physicality. This is talking about hearing the words of God. So, of course, it's in this vein that we have a kind of generic usage of water as a metaphor for the Word of God, for the Torah. So, obviously, that's also part of this equation, without any question.
Yeah, which it's a beautiful thought, especially with that idea of the first and the latter and the fruitfulness. It's worth meditating on for me a lot, to think about it, and I'm gonna have to go to Joel chapter 2 and study that, because it's like, okay, because clearly there's seasons, and clearly it's dependent on God, and it's a beautiful thing, as I said earlier, that it sure would appear we're in a very unique season, based on the prophecies that we're seeing of what's actually going on agriculturally, as well as population wise, and the other things we've discussed in this podcast, that would be a sign for great hope, but also to make sure that we're taking full advantage of the spiritual rain that's falling as well, right?
Absolutely. Again, it of course all depends on God, that God is pouring out his spirit. But simultaneously, again, we need to prepare the vessels to receive it. When the hostages came home, after living in this hellhole for virtually 2 full years, and you hear that the first thing one of the hostages asked for, and he wasn't coming from a religious background, was a prayer shawl. And this awakening of spirit that has taken place over the course of the last 2 years in Israel is just such an extraordinary thing. So yes, it's not just physical rain. It is God pouring out his spirit, and people who are really readying the vessels to receive it. We're living in extraordinary times.
Yeah. A lot to think about there today. no doubt. Another amazing episode. Time to. I hope, like me, that you're thinking, man, I need to go back and check these passages out. And on a completely side and wild note, but nonetheless, my mind went there, so I had to tell you that about 3 years ago, I started to get real conscious about my health, and I guess I've heard it said, and maybe you've heard it said, that when the pupil's ready, the master will appear. And I was, studying nutrition all over the place, and as usual, I go to the National Religious Broadcasters Convention every year as my normal routine. Actually, get an opportunity to interview a lot of rabbis while I'm there. Well, one of the people that I interviewed was a nutritionist, and she had written a book, The 7 Foods of the Promised Land. And she went on to tell me what I did not know out of Deuteronomy, like you just described, that here are these species. And she said, these are food that God says is good. If you eat, I don't care what anybody says about bread, if you eat whole grain, and she described what it would be, and if you ate pomegranates and dates and figs, that you would be shocked at what that would do for you. So my wife and I, we took this completely to heart, because I said, well, that makes perfect sense. If God's word says that this food is good, then obviously it must be good. So we bought a grinder, and we went out and bought all these wheat berries and rye berries and barley, because barley was one and wheat was one. And then we got pomegranates and grapes and figs and all that, and began to create breakfast, lunch, and dinners meals that were strictly with that. And we went on a 90-day 7 Foods of the Promised Land diet. And over a period of time, I lost about 70 pounds. I went off one of my diabetic medicines and one of my blood pressure medicines. The results were almost phenomenal for how I feel. And to this day, like this very morning, I ate the 7 Foods of the Promised Land breakfast. I ate my special bread that Tammy makes me out of wheat and barley, and I ate my pomegranates and my dates and my figs and my oil and my grapes. Oh, my grapes! Oh, I love my grapes. And so I'm telling you about Deuteronomy chapter 8. Those verses are spectacular to me, because I know how I feel as a result of eating those foods which God said is good. Right?
All I can say is, we don't believe there's a war between body and soul. We believe that the soul ultimately can uplift the body as well. So these are soul foods, and if they're soul foods, then that means that they can also sustain the body on some level.
Yeah, So anyway, I just find that whole thing, when you were talking about it, I couldn't help but relate. Well, yeah, I ate all that this morning. And I can tell you, it's a delight. It's a delight to find fresh pomegranates. And again, when I went to Israel last May to eat those foods, and then again, I look forward to being there in January, or I hope I get to see you and eat those foods then in the Promised Land. But I suppose we got to go. And again, I'm so grateful for all those listening, and so grateful for you, Rabbi, and your teaching is amazing.
Well, I'm so grateful to you, Pastor Robbie, and everyone who is joining this podcast, because just the opportunity to have this coming together in the Word of God is the greatest blessing. And of course, I bless you from Jerusalem, from the source of all blessing, and we're looking forward to continuing on our journey together, shoulder to shoulder.
Yes, shalom, amen. I look forward to it. God bless from here in North Carolina, and
God bless you from Jerusalem, from Zion.
God's holy city.